Alison, the firm, the cross-community gang with LVF DNA, famously described by yourself as not the Kinahans, yet clearly well capable of murder. Who are they again?
The thing about the firm is that the actual core membership of the firm is a handful of quite sort of serious, heavy criminals, people, as you say, who had links to the LVF, people who would have been at one stage household names, people who would appear in the Sunday World on a weekly basis. And then you have the sons and at some occasions the grandsons of what would have been quite senior IRA figures in and around the North-Armagh area during the Troubles, which is a bizarre combination of people. There's some cases which are ongoing which we can't talk about, but at some stage I'll come back and we can talk about the weird links between people whose relatives might have been involved in IRA operations, murders even, and a relative of loyalists who were also involved in similar and linked to really serious crimes. This is a bizarre combination of criminals who are clearly motivated by one thing, and that's finance. They're making a lot of money. But what has happened is, because the firm has gained almost sort of legendary status, it refers to everything, that a lot of people who might be just petty drug dealers, knocking out drugs at the weekend for their friends, when stopped are saying, "Oh, I'm the firm, touch me and you're dead." So it's became such a large gang crossing such a big geographical area that now the actual DNA of the firm, I suppose, if you trace it back to its roots, it was a small group of people, yes, cross community, which we'd never really seen before in a crime gang, but now it has grown. And one of the new things about it is they have quite a significant number of women drug dealing for them. We wouldn't have particularly seen that. We do see drug gangs exploiting young women and using young women whose houses they would maybe store drugs and weapons in. And we have had those stories in the past about young women being sexually exploited because they owe debts to drug gangs. But they've got quite a lot of young women who are quite heavily involved at a senior level in drug dealing. I had a conversation with another journalist in here, and she was like, "Well, isn't that equality? What do we do? We fought for the rights to vote and for women to be as much involved in criminality as men, but there is quite a lot of women involved in the firm too, which is an unusual move."
There's a theory, and I don't know what you think of it. Really, it's a whole other podcast, but I'll throw it in here because when we look at the DNA of this, there is a theory, and I've heard it many times, is that the ETAB, when the ETAB came here, and it was related to the dance scene, that people found themselves under the influence of this drug, that various people from different backgrounds found themselves in dance places in the Banbridge area, in the Armagh area, in the Portadown area, etc., under the influence of ETABs, and they all got talking and they all went to the house parties together. I've heard that many, many times from people in the know.
There's a great sort of, it's not like a mainstream documentary, but there is a sort of independent documentary that covers that, at the worst times of the Troubles. And you would have had, at this stage, you had the UDA quite heavily involved in the importation of drugs. But then remember, you also had those really serious drug dealers from Catholic areas, the direct action against drugs ones. We might be doing a podcast later in terms of the sort of Speedy Fagans, the Brandy Campbells and Mickey Mooney's, Mickey Mooney from the Short Strand, and they're all going to places like Circus, as you say, in Banbridge, and the loyalist drug dealers at one end of the rave, the Catholic drug dealers at the other end of the rave, and eventually they all meet in the middle. So yeah, there has been crossover in the past, but they operated, I suppose, independently, financially, in their own drug gangs, albeit there might have been interactions with each other. The firm is a cross-community drug gang, and that's the only way we can describe it. That's what it is.
We make it sound progressive. It's not progressive.
It is certainly not progressive, but what we did find out through Anchor Chat is too, the pretense that Republicans keep themselves separate from loyalists in all sorts of walks of life is just not true. There is a lot of crossover.
And that's another subject we'll have to return to. Now, let's look at the latest. An as yet untitled crime gang, which has been linked to unsolved killing in the Armagh area, is under threat from the firm, we understand, over an attack on a man who later died. There's a lot in there to unpack.
There is, and while we can't name them for legal reasons, every single person from the Armagh area will know who I'm talking about when we talk about this other crime gang who are deeply disliked. Let's just say they're made up mainly of members of a family almost who would be related to each other and extended relatives But outside of that, they're really not well got in terms of people despise them, I think is the right word. And I've had a lot of contact from people since we started reporting on this story who have said, this is what they're involved in, that's what they're involved in. It's quite unsavoury stuff. It's not,
So it's
all criminality is unsavoury, but this is going into the realms of, really anti-community, anti-social, and bullying as well. There'd be people who would bully other members of the community who tried to stand up to them.
Having said that, there's a lot of bottom feeding going on in the firm as well.
There is, yeah.
So as you said, they're not high class gangsters.
They're not definitely not high class gangsters. These are people mostly living in housing estates in and around, like in Portadown, Armagh. They're not, the Gilligans of this world living. These are people who are knocking out a considerable amount of drugs, but most of the people at the bottom will be drug dealing more or less to feed their habit. They won't be making very much money. The people at the top are making pretty big sums of money. And if you can imagine, if you're making big sums of money, people owe you large sums of money as well. And that's where I suppose you need enforcers. You need people who are going to go and collect those debts. You need people who are not afraid to go and knock an equally pretty dangerous criminal's door and say, you owe us 50k, you owe us 100k, you owe us 200k, pay up or else.
Right. Now, the victim at the centre of the story, the man at the centre of this story, Stephen Smith, who has a very colourful record, to say the least. He is a convicted double killer. He passed away unexpectedly this month. He was a father of 3, aged in his 40s. Now, what has happened here?
So this dates back to a story that you and I covered at the time, and it was a guy called Thomas O'Hare, and the Smith brothers went to his house in 2006 to set fire to it. They said in court they just wanted to destroy the home so they couldn't live in the home. They didn't want to harm anyone. That was their defence, which the jury actually accepted. But Thomas O'Hare was a paedophile. He was a convicted sex offender, and one of his victims was the youngest of the Smith brothers, which was Stephen Smith. And Stephen Smith, unusually, and I've covered dozens, maybe hundreds of criminal trials over the year, Stephen Smith gave evidence, and during that trial, Thomas O'Hare was killed in this firebomb attack. The brothers went to his house, they poured an accelerant around the house. When it set fire, the whole house went up in a ball of flames. Thomas O'Hare was killed. The brothers, all of the Smith brothers were really badly burnt. And Thomas O'Hare's 21-year-old girlfriend, Lisa McClatchy, who was also in the home at the time, was badly burnt and then later died from her injuries in hospital. It was a huge story at the time.
And it was horrific.
It was absolutely horrendous. I mean, you can't imagine a worse story, because you have this young woman who was completely innocent to all of this caught up in this story, this horror story, where you have a sex offender, you have the victim of that sex offender, you have his brothers who are outraged. And during the trial, I mean, people in the public gallery were crying. I mean, as the evidence was being given, it was a horrendous case.
You mean for listeners who who have this innate sympathy for Smith, and they clearly are out there. I remember covering this at the time. Lisa McClatchy, when you hear her evidence, she lived, she spoke, she went to the neighbours. She said, "I'm burnt," and her belt buckle burnt into her body, and she survived for a period of time, like many other burn victims, in the knowledge that she wasn't going to live. So it was utterly shocking now. But we have to say that all 4 brothers were badly burnt in this attack, because they didn't realise. So
Stephen, Martin, Al and Christopher, all 4 of them were badly burned. As you said, they took off across the border and showed up in a hospital in the south to be treated for their injuries, which were again at one stage quite life-threatening. I think some of them were so badly burned.
They said at the time, I remember, just to recall, they didn't realise that the petrol would become vapour. They thought that it would remain as liquid, and they didn't realise when they lit it that the air was on fire, and they had no idea about that.
Look, and this is the thing. There's no winners in this story, but at the time, and I will say this, there's no point in saying anything else. In the area, there was a degree of sympathy for Stephen Smith because he was a victim of a paedophile. There was also a huge outpouring of sympathy for Lisa McClatchy. There was very little sympathy for Thomas O'Hare, but as a result of this, the jury accepted that it wasn't murder, that it was manslaughter, and the brothers were all given fairly significant sentences considering it was a manslaughter. They have served their time, and all of those brothers are out. I think Niall Smith was jailed for 10 years, and the other three brothers were all jailed for 11 years each.
So bring this forward to the current time. Smith, he died a number of weeks ago after it's thought that he suffered a seizure at home. So what's this got to do with the farm?
Well, the reason his family believed he suffered the seizure, and we need to be really clear here that because we don't know the seizure was connected. What happened previous to that is that Stephen Smith was said to be working as an enforcer for the farm, that he had went to collect a debt. There was a huge debt involved in this. And there has been a lot of speculation as to what happened next. So he clearly got into an altercation with members of this other crime family. And then during that altercation, he was hit with a car, as well as suffering other serious head injuries. He went to hospital and he was treated, but he refused to give a police statement. And so there was no police investigation into it at the time. He was then released from hospital, and people thought that he was fine. He was obviously injured, but he was making a recovery from those injuries. And then he suffered a seizure at home and died.
Now, clearly, I would say that I'm on safe ground to say that his family would deny that he had any links to the firm.
Yes, and not just his family, his funeral was huge. There was a lot of people from that area, including members of a local Gaelic team, lots of sporting event, and there was lots of also notices, funeral notices from, really respected organisations and sporting organisations in the area. The Smith family would have been pretty well got, I suppose, in sporting circles. But as well at that huge funeral, there were also people who I would know and other crime reporters would know is quite significant operators in the drugs trade in Northern Ireland. And they were also at the funeral, and that also sent a message. And I think what also sends a message is the fact that none of this was reported to police, because we're now told that the farm have said we are going to deal with this ourselves in our own time. There is and has been a huge police presence in and around the area since then. The PSNI are saying that there is no investigation or suspicious circumstances of that their inquiries are ongoing. They're saying, I suppose, what is being said off the record is there's no police complaint. So how can we then deal with this as a crime? Because no one complained at the time and we weren't investigating what had happened at the time. He refused to make a complaint, and he is the only real eyewitness to this, let's face it. So the chances of getting any kind of conviction for anything that happened to him now that he is gone and he was the person who was the victim and the witness to it are very, very slim. And therefore we have a situation which often arises, especially when you're dealing with criminal gangs like this. They like to keep any kind of retribution to themselves, among themselves.
And the firm are capable of violence. They want their money back. They need their money back. And you can't have somebody beating up on your enforcer. That's not how it works.
No, and they're also, involved in several murders already. So we have had the Malcolm McKeown murder, which was carried out by members of the firm, again, over drug debt. We also have the Shane Whitla case, again, over drug debt. So there are cases ongoing, and then you also have members of the firm who have been killed as well. We had the killed in West Belfast, a member of the firm who was on bail at the time for killing Shane Whitla, or involvement in the killing of Shane Whitla. And there are speculation that the firm had paid a dissident Republican gang to do that because that person was likely to turn state witness, because they were charged with quite a minor role in the killing rather than actually being the gunman himself.
I suppose some listeners might be very interested in the economics behind this, because obviously a lot of people take an awful lot of drugs. Drugs are a huge part of our society.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it openly. It's one of those things, but we do know that a lot of people take an awful lot of drugs, and a lot of people, drugs destroy lives. An awful lot of people enjoy drugs. That's the reality of it. But how much money is really out there? Because sometimes I hear about the current prices of drugs, and I think that's not that expensive. Especially, frankly, let's put it out there, when you take the price of alcohol.
Yeah, and the thing about it is Ireland has a real cocaine problem, and that's a fact. And Northern Ireland no different than the south of Ireland. And this is not something that people think happens in city centre nightclubs and bars. This is happening in we country bars all over the place. It's happening at house parties. It's happening all over the place, and people disassociate. So they say there's people who would think, Well, if I take drugs when I have my one night a month out, I'm not contributing to, the criminality that goes on behind this, or the death, or the murder, the misery, the enforcers, or the guns, or the killings. But in reality, they are. I mean, they're obviously a very small part of it. But the fact is, drugs is like any other business. It's a supply and demand business. If there's no demand, there's no need for the supply.
It's a whole other podcast, really, because somebody was saying to me recently that they were shocked to see someone in a city centre bar just taking out a little device and snorting white powder up their nose, as if they were taking a sip from the drink. There was no effort to go to the toilet or anything.
And we grandas, your dad, your granda, this isn't something that's only a young people problem as well. Remember, you were talking there about the rave culture that hit here in the late 80s and the early 90s. There's some people who, when I would know them and you would know them, and they're the oldest raver in town, and they're still going, and they're in their late 50s now, and they're still holding on to that. And at the weekend, they're still taking drugs and putting on the old school dance tunes and dancing around their kitchen. I mean, it's as if this is something that is confined. And I know if it's not your world, you're thinking that's bizarre. But, this is the fact, and it's reality. That's why there's so much money in it, because you're not just having to target one section of society. This isn't just, 19 and 20-year-olds. This is right across the entire spectrum. And, organisations like the Farm, there will only be a handful of them making serious money at the top, but they have dozens and dozens of young runners or young women literally knocking drugs out of their house on a Friday night at a rapid rate, or delivering them to parties when they're getting a phone call at 2 a.m.
We could talk about house parties all day now, but let's drag this back.
Listen, the thing about a house party is you never want to be the last to leave. Get yourself out of there before there's one warm tin of harp left between a room full of people.
This gang in Armagh, an unsavoury crowd, by all reports, who seem to owe the firm money. I mean, they are the chief suspects. We're not going to name them, of course, in 2 killings which utterly shocked the Armagh community. This happened back in 2008, and this was seemingly unrelated to drugs. And that was the murder of a 45-year-old Victor Stewart. He was a farmer, just finished his tea when his killers struck. A safe was taken from his house, so robbery was suspected. And then 62-year-old widower Eileen Corrigan was strangled in her home, and detectives felt that it was a burglary gone wrong. I mean, that's quite uncommon here.
It's very uncommon, and I question the burglary gone wrong in the case of Eileen. I would think that is definitely a cold case that needs reviewed. There seems to be more sinister motive involved in that, but these were 2 neighbours. One a widow, one a farmer, who seemingly had neither of them lived quite solitary, quiet lives. He tended to his farm. She was almost reclusive since the death of her husband. Both of them would have kept money in their homes, and so you can see that a robbery might have been a motive for their houses being invaded. And yourself, back especially rural people of a certain age, they tend not to trust a lot of institutions and keep a bit of money around the house and maybe have dealing cash rather than anything else. But for someone to go in and murder someone over money, it is practically unheard of, and for 2 neighbours in such close proximity to die within a few weeks of each other is equally unheard of. I mean, these were, again, huge stories at the time, and remain, albeit unsolved. There was one person, I think, was convicted, but they claimed they were the driver and had a very minimal role, and they didn't realise that there was going to be violent shoes and thought they were just taking part in a robbery. But in terms of Eileen, no one has ever been convicted of her killing. They remain unsolved, but if you talk to people in that area, they'll tell you they know exactly who was involved, and that is probably why, as I say, when you're talking about this crime gang that's come up against the Farm, neither of them, we're not talking about the good cop, bad cop here. Neither of them are nice groups of people, but there is a particular distaste for this gang.
I have to say that one man was convicted of the manslaughter of Mr. Stewart. He drove the getaway car and helped to ransack Mr. Stewart's house. Now, there is no suggestion that this individual was involved in any way in the killing of Mrs. Corrigan or in the recent assault on Mr. Smith. Nevertheless, the killers of these 2 neighbours, as we said, have never been caught, although locally suspicion fell on a crime gang in the Armagh area. Is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't asked you about this particular?
I think we're stuck into dangerous territory if we're hanging around too long.
Allison Morris, security correspondent with the Belfast Telegraph. Thank you very much.